Okay, all good.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. Welcome everyone to this webinar, this very important and special webinar today. This webinar is called The New Cold War: Who Benefits, Who Pays, and What is Needed to Stop It? A Canadian Perspective. My name is Kiran Fatima, and I will be hosting today's program. Today's event will start off with talks from our panelists, followed by a Q&A session. I'm going to ask everybody to mute themselves. Thank you. Great. So today's event will start off with talks from our esteemed panelists, followed by a Q&A session. For those who are watching live on YouTube, you will be able to submit your questions through the live chat feature on YouTube, and you can press the live chat button under this video if you don't see that section. So the Canadian Peace Congress, which is co-sponsoring today's important discussion, we're doing so because we are increasingly alarmed by the deteriorating international situation marked by a new Cold War, which poses an existential threat to all humanity and to the global environment we all share. Once again, as before, during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the world is being dragged down the rabbit hole of militarism, hate propaganda, and war hysteria. And a dangerous drift, we are dangerously drifting towards another world war. And that has horrendous consequences that could occur if we were to fall into that. Once again, imperialist countries are targeting and demonizing the states and the peoples who are considered threats to their global domination and their control. And the drums of war are beating louder and louder with each passing day. We are particularly concerned with Canada's role in this dangerous escalation of tensions. Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei, remains under house arrest almost 2.5 years after her detention in Vancouver, and she faces extradition to the US. She's being used as a political pawn in this campaign of pressure and intimidation by US imperialism, and we call for her immediate release. Canada's parliament has also been drawn into this campaign, accusing China of, quote, genocide against its Uyghur minority, based entirely on unfounded allegations, lack of evidence, and smears. This past week, the Trudeau government, the Liberal government in Canada, dropped a new budget. Instead of addressing the main concerns of the Canadian people, which is to improve our healthcare system, whose frailties and shortcomings have only become more obvious during the COVID-19 pandemic, instead of raising the living standards and social conditions of workers, including rebuilding our industrial and manufacturing base, instead of ending the genocidal oppression of Indigenous people in Canada, instead of building more housing and mass transit and other aspects of our infrastructure, which is crumbling, instead of all this, the budget actually aims to prop up the profit margins of the giant monopolies and finance increased militarization and preparation for a perpetual war. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been put aside for new fighter jets, frigates, and weaponized drones. Over $1 billion are marked for restoration of NATO and NORAD, including missile defense. And a lot of this will be used for militarized Middle East strategy and regime change in Latin America and in other places. At the Canadian Peace Congress, we feel it's not just a moral duty, but also a practical necessity to push back and reverse this dangerous course of action. We stand for an alternative. We stand for a new independent foreign policy for Canada based on peace, disarmament, and respect for the UN Charter and international law, not based on aggression and war. At the center of this alternative demand is the demand that Canada get out of NATO and NORAD once and for all. And we think uniting and building up the peace and anti-imperialist forces across Canada and around the world to win such an alternative is very urgent, more urgent than ever. So we hope today's discussion will help contribute toward this vital effort. So let's get into it. Our first presenter today is Vijay Prashad. Vijay is the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. He's also the chief editor for Leftward Books, author of over 30 books, including Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, Red Star Over the Third World, and his latest, Washington Bullets. Please welcome Vijay Prashad.
Well, it's great to be with you on a platform which is based in Canada, the world's headquarters of international mining companies, who in fact determine the foreign policy of the Canadian government, whether it's the Conservatives or, Justin Trudeau, who himself is a model of soft power, attempting to use his charm to somehow hallucinate people off the cliff and not see that it's the mining companies that whisper in the ear of people in Ottawa and determine their regime change policies regarding Venezuela and so on. I've often thought, friends, it shouldn't be called the Lima Group, this group set up illegally against the UN Charter, against the Organization of American States Charter. Shouldn't be called the Lima Group. It should be called the Ottawa Group, if we're honest, because Canada stands behind and defines a lot of this regime change stuff in Venezuela. I don't believe for a minute that one should make the assumption that Canada has a superior position than the United States when it comes to foreign policy. So Kiran, I really appreciate you saying it's time for Canada, for the Canadian people to demand that Canada walks away from NATO, because this is a key issue with this Cold War being ratcheted against China. COVID-19 continues to plague the planet. India is falling apart as a consequence of this. So is Brazil. So is the United States. Let's face facts, friends. This should be where our energies are focused. Tedros, the Secretary General or Director General of the World Health Organization, last year, when the pandemic was declared on the 11th of March, last year he said we need solidarity, not stigma, not the rise of anti-Asian, particularly anti-Chinese sentiment. The nonsense being spewed by Trump's White House at the time needed to be directly confronted, and I'm afraid it was not confronted by the leaders of the G7, including not confronted by Canada's Justin Trudeau. Where were the public statements calling for solidarity, not stigma? Just didn't come from Ottawa, as it didn't come from London, didn't come from any of the other G7 capitals. Go back further. The Chinese have been saying for the last 15 years, we want collaboration, not confrontation. In fact, that phrase is essential at this time. Collaboration, not confrontation. We need to get a grip of this pandemic. We need to get a grip of COVID-19. That has to be the focus, not the kind of warmongering and military spending that we're seeing from the North Atlantic states. So, I want to start there because, look, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Deng Xiaoping onward till Xi Jinping, all the Chinese leaders, the premiers and presidents of that country have called for multipolarity, have called for multilateralism, regionalism, some sort of collaborative politics to deal with the genuine problems in the world, problems of climate change, problems of nuclear annihilation, problems of various forms of social toxicity, including terrorist activity and so on. They've called for collaboration. That was the basis of the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, first set up as the Shanghai Five in 1992, then as the SCO in 2001 to deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan and so on. I don't have time to get into that, but that's a very important part of why Xinjiang is now being pointed to as a hotspot. It has a lot to do with the confrontation over who gets to define the politics of Central Asia and of the Silk Road. The United States, from the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union onward, has produced a confrontational policy against China. Whether it was the New Silk Road initiative of Hillary Clinton, which she announced in Chennai in India in July of 2011, or it's the pivot to Asia in general of Barack Obama, whether it's the Indo-Pacific Command during Donald Trump, the ratcheted up trade war that Trump prosecuted against China, whether it's the Quad, which was formed during Obama's period, that's India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, alongside the Five Eyes intelligence network to encircle, put pressure on China, whether it's that, all of these combined demonstrate that the United States, with its G7 partners, including Canada, have pushed a very aggressive policy to encircle and pressure China. This includes, friend, this includes NATO's intervention into Afghanistan. Now the United States has said that they will withdraw troops in September onward. NATO has said they will withdraw. The British have said they will withdraw. Not sure how much they'll actually withdraw, but nonetheless, you got to understand that NATO has already been involved in the encirclement of China. It's not that now they may start some sort of Asian NATO. NATO was already present for 20 years in Afghanistan, aggressively on the border of China. So this policy of confrontation has to be registered. This is there. Meanwhile, we had Jiang Zemin talk about the fact that after the collapse of the USSR, he said there's one superpower, many great powers. I want to put this down there because I need to clarify that if you look at what the Chinese government, how they're orienting themselves to the world, the Chinese government is suggesting they would like a multipolar world order. They are not competing with the United States. They don't want to compete with the United States. They don't want to supplant the US in any way. This is not a contest over hegemony. That's a fantasy of the US State Department. That's the fantasy of US elites who are paranoid about the loss of their preeminent position. The Chinese are simply not in the game of trying to go above the United States. In fact, their theorem is one superpower, many great powers. But even so-called many great powers is not to be permitted by the United States government. Why is the US government so transfixed by China in particular, to a lesser extent Russia, but why is it so transfixed by China? It's not illogical. It's actually deeply logical. And I very much hope you'll go and read the Tricontinental Red Alert, which is on the US imposed hybrid war on China, because we make an argument there. Our argument is as a consequence of Chinese developments after 1978, from the reform in 1978, deepened in 1992. As a consequence of that reform agenda, the Chinese were able to draw in scientific and technological know-how. You see, the Chinese took a very interesting position. They argued that we don't want merely the transfer of technology when we open up our economy to foreign direct investment. We don't want mainly the transfer of technology, because technology is yesterday's science. We want the transfer of science because science is tomorrow's technology. And it's as a reason of really good deals that they signed with European, US, Japanese, South Korean firms that came in to take advantage of well-fed, highly disciplined labor in places like Shenzhen and so on. They were able to draw in science. As a consequence of that, in several fields such as telecommunications, particularly 5G, robotics, green technology, GPS technology, and so on. As a consequence of this drawing in of science and of technology, Chinese firms in these particular areas have leapfrogged 1 to 2 generations above US and European, and to some extent Japanese and South Korean companies. The existential threat that Chinese high-tech production, the existential threat this poses to Silicon Valley and so on, should not be underestimated. There is a rational reason why the United States government is out there confronting China. It wants China to roll back on its technological advances, on its scientific advances. This is not merely about some abstract world domination. There is a actual materialist basis to this confrontation. It comes down to the fact that Chinese high-tech has advanced greatly, and the United States has made it clear, we would not mind, say the US planners, if China produces the goods of US and European companies, but we simply will not allow Chinese companies to export their goods around the world, because this threatens the monopoly patent advantages held by telecommunications companies in the West. This is a serious, serious challenge, and the entire Cold War is premised on this challenge. It has to be known to people in the West that If you want to compete with China, improve your science, put more money into your own educational systems. You destroy your educational systems and then you wonder why you're not able to compete on a firm plane. You are using extra economic power to confront China. The other word that we use for extra economic power of this kind is imperialism. Let's be frank and admit it then. This is an imperialist war against China. If you actually want to compete against China economically, produce better stuff, produce it at a better price. That's a genuine, that's a genuine commercial engagement. But you don't want to engage China commercially. You want to engage China militarily and in an information war. I don't have time to get into Hong Kong, Xinjiang, all these things. I'm happy to talk about them because there's a lot to say about them. There's a lot to say about them. Well, I've taken you in 10 minutes into an introduction to the new Cold War. I want you to really understand that this is not an irrational conflict. This conflict is happening for a particular material reason. People in the West, in Canada, in the United States, in Europe need to confront the fact that their economies have become relatively moribund as a consequence of the cannibalization of their human capacity, cannibalization of the infrastructure by capitalist class that has been drawing profit out of the economy, drawing profit out of social wealth, and not contributing to it at all. Your problem is not China. Your problem is your own capitalist class. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for that, Vijay. Thank you very much. I just want to remind everybody, we will have a Q&A section. So if you have any questions for Vijay or any of our speakers, please put them in the live chat underneath the video on YouTube, and we will get to that right after all the speakers have gone. So our next speaker is Margaret Kimberly. Margaret is an editor and senior columnist at Black Agenda Report. She's also the coordinating committee member of the Black Alliance for Peace and the author of Prejudential Black America and the Presidents. Margaret, please join us.
Thank you so much, Kieran. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the Communist Party of Canada and the Canadian Peace Congress for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It's interesting that we are holding this event on April 25th. On that date in 1945, US and Soviet troops met in the city of Torgau, Germany, as the defeat of Nazi Germany was imminent. But it was a marriage of convenience and it didn't last long. The first Cold War began shortly thereafter. This new Cold War is 30 years old and began after the fall of the Soviet Union. Since that time, the US and NATO allies have literally encroached upon the very borders of the Russian Federation, turning former Soviet satellites into Russia's enemies. NATO has taken on increasingly dangerous and provocative moves of late, as was seen this week in the Czech Republic. In 2014, I was not aware of it until this week. In 2014, an arms depot exploded, and at the time, the Czech government blamed the owner of the property and said nothing since then. Suddenly this week, they blamed Russian intelligence for the incident and named as perpetrators the two men who the British claim poisoned Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia 3 years ago. The Russians responded by expelling Czech diplomats, and the rest of us are confused. We may not know all of the details, but we do know that the Czech Republic and every other Eastern European NATO member nation does not act on its own volition. Speaking of the Skripals, they have been kidnapped by the British government, and aside from an obviously forced video testimonial from Yulia, they have not been heard from or seen since that time. These are just a couple of examples of war propaganda being directed at Russia by NATO. The new US President Joe Biden, never known for his intellect, allowed himself to be drawn into a quarrel with Vladimir Putin in a television interview. When asked if Putin is a killer, he replied, yes. The Russians were furious and recalled their ambassador home to Russia. Biden worsened things in a call with Putin, in which he claimed he wanted to improve relations, but then enacted additional sanctions against Russia the very next day. The Russians sent the US ambassador packing, and there is currently no top diplomatic representative in either country. The new administration is being equally provocative towards the People's Republic of China. In March, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken held a meeting with his Chinese counterparts in Anchorage, Alaska, and proceeded to publicly attack them. With the media present, he lectured them about what the US claims are human rights abuses taking place in their country. I hasten to add that the nation with the largest amount of military spending and mass incarceration, among other human rights violations, is in no position to lecture others. The best that can be said about this encounter is that it was a wake-up call to China. It confirmed that they cannot trust any US presidential administration. After the disastrous meeting, the Chinese proceeded to strengthen their ties to Russia and to announce an agreement with Iran, promising to purchase Iranian oil and other partnership agreements that soften the blow of US sanctions. The US and other NATO members, such as Canada, do the same throughout the world. The NATO coalition destroyed the Libyan state, created open slavery, and an ongoing humanitarian crisis. NATO nations continue to join the US in occupying Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. They support the ongoing war against Yemen, a genocide by any definition. They participate in sanctions which violate international law by exacting collective punishments against civilian populations. The US and Canada use the Organization of American States, the OAS, to bully other nations in this hemisphere into calling for a coup against the elected Venezuelan government, or support an illegal government in Haiti, which violates its own constitution by staying in office and violently repressing demands for democracy. The US and NATO cannot control other nations. To be clear, they are quite dangerous. They can destabilize, sanction, invade, and use proxies to cause great suffering, but they cannot impose their will upon others. There is another axis which stands up to the US-NATO axis, fortunately, and we must applaud every effort to maintain their sovereignty and their right to act in the interests of their people and fight against any attempt at hegemony. The subtitle of our meeting is Who Pays, Who Benefits, What is Needed to Stop It? The people pay in the United States when the president requests and will surely get a $750 billion defense budget, which takes up 60% of all discretionary spending. People in my country are always told that anything that will help them, like a free healthcare system, cannot be considered because it is too expensive. Of course, we could have our needs met if we didn't have this burden on our society, but we don't get what we want. After 20 years of occupying Afghanistan, we are told that a withdrawal, which the people want, is hasty and cannot be considered. People born after September 11th, 2001 are now old enough to join the military and be part of the Afghanistan occupation. People around the world pay, as their governments must choose between exercising their sovereignty and being attacked militarily and economically and suffering, or knuckling under and going along in order to keep the barbarians from the gate. Who benefits? The military-industrial complex benefits. I read recently that if the US really left Afghanistan, the Defense Department would be on the hook for millions of dollars in contracts. It is interesting that if I or anyone else participating in this webinar were to point out that war is profitable and continues because it is, we would be smeared as conspiracy theorists unworthy of getting a hearing. What is needed to stop this? Real democracy. That's difficult to have in countries that brag about this noble way of life, which they don't actually keep. That is why Canadians are protesting through hunger strikes and other actions that they oppose the purchase of fighter jets, which will inevitably impact their ability to have their needs met. Americans tend to think of Canada as being a better nation with a national healthcare system, and every presidential election, American liberals proclaim they will move there if the Republican wins. I give credit for taking the most basic action to meet human needs, but there's no reason to ignore the other aspects of Canadian governance that should not be ignored. Canadian mining and other interests have upheld puppet governments in Haiti and lead the Lima Group effort to make the Venezuelan coup plot appear to be supported by the whole hemisphere. There can't be any good nations in this axis, which terrorizes and threatens to terrorize the rest of the world. Of course, the underlying message is that the citizens of these supposedly good countries are also under threat should they attempt to speak out. That happens through many means. The UK and Canada use their parliaments to give the appearance that their populations believe China to be practicing genocide. These phony, non-binding resolutions amount to little more than war propaganda, but that doesn't mean they have no impact on public opinion. The case of Meng Wanzhou grinds on since 2018, when the Canadian government showed itself by going along with the US effort to arrest her, which was made on extremely dubious grounds. Instead of negotiating with China in good faith, the government allows 2 of its citizens to languish in jail in China rather than do the right and democratic thing. The corporate media in our countries play a crucial role in supporting governmental wrongdoing and then covering it up and lying to the people about their actions. It is nearly impossible to find the kind of information we are discussing today in the US or Canadian media. Protest and resistance must continue if the word democracy is to have any meaning. There is no way to contain China or Russia that doesn't involve hot war between nuclear powers. While we are told that the evil doing is in Beijing or Moscow, we see that Moscow making it clear that there will be no invasion of the Donbass region of Ukraine that won't result in war was actually the de-escalation that was needed. We can see that the myth of US and NATO control is just that. Having squandered opportunity and lost leverage, the hapless Americans have been pressured by the Europeans to rejoin the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, popularly known as the Iran nuclear deal. Talks have resumed in Vienna, but the Iranians are neither impressed nor intimidated. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif stated in a Twitter post that the US must remove all sanctions in order for the talks to progress to success. He added for emphasis, quote, "No Iran-US meeting, unnecessary," unquote. We shouldn't be surprised when the Czech or any other government suddenly makes bizarre anti-Russian statements. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline connecting Russia with China is nearly complete. Its very existence proves that claims of the dangers posed by Russia against Europe are lies. But the US-NATO axis has nothing to offer except lies and ham-fisted attempts to control what it cannot. We can expect more claims of Russian influence or Chinese genocide or something new we haven't yet heard about. I thank you all for joining us, not just for this event, but for joining us all in the effort to fight against imperialism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your words. Once again, friends and comrades, please put your questions in the live chat and we will be getting to them after everyone has spoken. Our next speaker is Omar Latif. Omar is a veteran Toronto trade unionist and anti-imperialist activist who has been a longtime member of the Committee of Progressive Pakistani Canadians and the Communist Party of Canada. Omar has traveled extensively across the world, including twice to China, and he visited Xinjiang in the summer of 2019. And he's one of the few Western eyewitnesses of what is most recently happening in Xinjiang, China. So Omar, please join us. And you're muted.
Here we go. Thank you to the Communist Party of Canada and the Canadian Peace Congress for inviting me to speak here. The first 5 minutes, I'll speak on my impressions of Xinjiang and what's happening to the Uyghur people. And the other half, I'll spend on the Canadian Labour Congress and its attitude to China. To begin with, it is clear to many at least that Western governments and the corporate-owned media lie when it suits them. The Gulf of Tonkin incident of 1965, in which the North Vietnamese had fired on US vessels, Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction, Muammar Gaddafi about to massacre several 100,000 civilians in Benghazi, the Syrian government using chemical weapons against its people. All, all were lies. Similar are the lies of imperialism against China and its supposed genocide of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Genocides of indigenous peoples were carried out by colonial settlers in Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, of Jews and others by Nazi Germany, of 500,000 to 1 million ethnic Chinese communists in 1965 by Indonesian generals. No genocide has taken place in Xinjiang. The Uyghur population has increased from 10.17 million in 2010 to 12.71 million in 2018, an increase of 25% in 9 years. During the same time, the Han Chinese population of Xinjiang has grown from 8.8 million to 9 million, or only 2%. But what about China, holding 1 to 2 million Uyghurs in concentration camps? Mind you, the population of Ottawa is 1 million, that of Montreal 1.6 million. Google the satellite picture of the ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal in March. You can count the containers on the top row. Where are the satellite pictures of the large prisons that would be required to hold such large numbers of prisoners? China did set up vocational and re-educational schools for the tiny minority of Uyghurs influenced by the fundamentalism of the terrorist East Turkestan Islamic movement that wants to set up a caliphate in Xinjiang. ETIM has the blessings of the United States, as did the Mujahideen once, or the Islamist terrorist groups in Syria. Terrorism affects Pakistan too. Did the state provide vocational or re-educational schools or economic development to the extremists? No. It sent in the army, helicopter gunships, tanks to try and root them out from their main bases in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province next to Afghanistan. Thousands of civilians were killed and wounded. A huge number of houses were destroyed. Over 1 million people were dislocated. Did you hear a peep of criticism from the Western governments? No, only exhortations to the Pakistan government to do more. Day in, day out, Israel brutalizes the Palestinian people. Not only do US and Canadian leaders do not criticize Israel, they actually support it. That China does not allow Uyghurs to fast or forces them to eat pork is simply laughable. How would it even do this? Through force feeding? I saw quite a few halal meat shops in the Uyghur area of Kashgar when I visited Xinjiang in the summer of 2019. I was there during Ramadan and saw plenty of Uyghurs eating openly during fasting hours, something fundamentalists wouldn't allow in some Muslim majority countries. Restaurants serve halal food. You can go and see for yourself. Men wearing beards and women wearing the headscarf. There are 24,000 mosques in Xinjiang. Does China not allow Uyghurs to use their language? Go visit for yourself. You will see signage on buildings and newspapers in Uyghur and hear Uyghurs speaking their own language openly in restaurants, on sidewalks, in parks, as I did. Does China forcibly sterilize Uyghur women? There seems to be no logic to this charge. First of all, Uyghurs and other national minorities in China were exempt from the one-child policy applied strictly to the Han Chinese for 4 decades, from 1978 to 2017. Secondly, The approximately 12 million Uyghurs are only 0.85% of China's total population of 1.4 billion. Why would China want to restrict their population now? But what about the falling birth rate among Uyghur women? For the same reason, birth rates have fallen elsewhere. Higher education and more and higher paid jobs for women outside the house. Less necessity for parents to have large numbers of children to take care of them in old age. Urbanization, uh, the weakening of patriarchal controls, though they still exist, and the strengthening of women's independence, including control over their own bodies. It is true that that development in China, especially since 1978, started on the East Coast, then moved to the center and was late in coming to Xinjiang. However, since around 2000, with the central government paying special attention, Xinjiang has developed rapidly. Per capita GDP is US $8,300, much higher than in neighboring India, 6,700, Pakistan 5,860, Bangladesh 4,700. Overall, in all categories, infant and mortality rates, life expectancy, food intake, literacy and education, housing, healthcare, women's freedoms, availability of clean drinking water and sanitation facilities, infrastructure, science, and technology, Xinjiang has shown great improvement and is far ahead of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. People will see through imperialism's lies eventually, but for now, many believe them because they're repeated in Goebbelian fashion 24/7 by the mass media. These lies have a special effect on those who have internalized anti-communism since early childhood. There are also those who unknowingly or knowingly do not analyze politics through the prism of capitalism and of imperialism. Which brings me to the leadership of the Canadian Labour Congress, the highest body of organized labor with 3.3 million members in Canada. In fairness, the CLC did take strong positions against apartheid South Africa, Chile's brutal dictator Augusto Pinochet, and in solidarity with the Palestinians. Though, with the notable exception of Sid Ryan of the Ontario Federation of Labour, rarely have the higher leadership of organized labor attended, much less spoken at pro-Palestinian rallies. In other matters, the CLC leaves one head shaking. For example, it won't take an active role in marking May Day, the International Day of the Working Class, nor will it use the C word. No, not communism, but class, like the working class it represents, or for that matter, terms like imperialism. In some cases, the CLC and the AFL-CIO in the US seem to be a foreign policy arms of their respective governments. Like the AFL-CIO, the CLC wined and dined the anti-communist Lech Walesa of Solidarność, probably the only labor leader who has addressed the Canadian Parliament and the US Congress. The CLC should evaluate that support now. Whose interest does a fully capitalist Poland, integrated into NATO, heavily influenced by religion, fully capitalist serve? Of the workers, of women, of secularism, of peace? In line with Washington and Ottawa, the AFL-CIO and the CLC supported the Wahhabi, fundamentalist, misogynist Afghan Mujahideen in the counter-revolutionary war against the April 1978 Afghan Revolution, led by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. Here too, the CLC should reflect whether in Afghanistan under the Mujahideen or the Taliban, or even now, has been better for workers, for peasants, for women, minorities than under the PDPA. Now, the CLC is dancing to the China is committing genocide against the Uyghurs tune being played by the ruling capitalist classes of the West in imperialism's Cold War against Communist Party-led China. Many think that the US-led NATO, including Canada, attacked Iraq and Libya because of faulty intelligence. The truth is the opposite. The US had already made the decision to attack Iraq, Libya, and Syria. It manufactured evidence to justify the attacks. The decision to ramp up this Cold War against China goes back to at least the Obama administration's pivot to the East in 2001. One of the justifications for it is the supposed genocide of Uyghurs. It is surprising that the CLC cannot see that an enemy enables the military-industrial complex to suck ever more resources into its insatiable maw at the cost of, for example, affordable housing, drinking water for indigenous people, free childcare and free university, better healthcare, higher pensions, while helping to despoil the environment. It is surprising that the growth of prejudice and violence against Canadians of Chinese ancestry, which the CLC condemns, is directly linked to the anti-China narrative being pushed by the Western governments and the mass media. The CLC must call on the Justice Chrystia Freeland Liberal government to release Ms. Meng Wanzhou, arrested due to pressure from the US that has led to needless tensions between Canada and China. Labor leaders should call for an end to the anti-China propaganda. Labor leaders should be in the forefront of a peace campaign that, among other things, calls for an end to this Cold War against China, on for its replacement with peaceful and mutually beneficial relations. That is a policy in the best interests of the working classes of the peoples of Canada and China. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you for bringing all that insight and experience for us today. I want to show this contact information for the Canadian Peace Congress and the Communist Party of China.
Canada?
The Communist Party of Canada. We are co-sponsoring this event today because we are concerned about the Cold War against China and against Russia and the ongoing militarism. So if you would like to contact us, please do so at this at any of this contact information that's on the screen. We're also going to be hosting a Q&A session, so please do put your questions into the live chat on YouTube. So let's get to our next speaker, who is Bahman Azad. Bahman is the Executive Secretary of the U.S. Peace Council. He is also the NGO representative of the World Peace Council at the United Nations. Bahman, please join us when you can.
Thank you very much, Kiran, and thanks to Canadian Peace Congress for organizing this important and timely event, especially at this critical juncture. I would like, it's an honor for me to be sitting next to all of these prominent activists around the country of US and Canada to speak about the current situation. Of course, other speakers have talked in detail about everything that is going on in the world right now, and it is really criminal in many ways. But I would like to limit myself to talking about some general trends that are going on in our world today, and I think they are very significant. Of course, everybody knows that our world is passing through a very, very dangerous times these days, and every day it's getting more dangerous compared to the day before. Once again, since the abrupt dismantling of the socialist camp in 1990s and the ascent of US imperialism to the status of the sole superpower, I think the world is once more witnessing the emergence of a new alignment or realignment of forces at the global level. With the rise of China as a global power and the increasing resistance by a great number of countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and in the Middle East, and even some European countries, it is clear that the US imperialism is losing its domineering control over the direction of the world events. The failure of the neocons or the neocon policy of preventing the emergence of another contending power to the unilateral domination of US is becoming more and more visible and evident. The decline of US economic power, now exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, is reducing the US imperialism's ability to control the present global situation by military means or by economic means, something that the US is desperately trying to prevent. In my view, we are witnessing today the last-ditch effort to reverse this process, to reverse this objective global process before it's too late, by the US, of course. US imperialism has now intensified its confrontations with China and Russia, is resorting to maximum pressure, economic pressure, through sanctions on more than closer to 400 countries, including Russia and China, and has intensified its policy of forced regime change against all nations that resist its domination. In fact, the Biden administration is not only continuing the same neocon policy adopted and implemented globally by George W. Bush administration, and then continued loyally by the Obama administration, and to some degree intensified by Trump administration. It is intensifying. And there is an objective reason for this. This is being done primarily because of the continuous decline of US power, and because of the shift from the Trump administration's unilateral approach, which was a failure in many ways, of America First, which alienated a lot of US allies in Europe and other countries, to Biden reversal to what was the policy of Obama administration also, to NATO First policy. This means that the Biden administration, knowing how weakened it was, US government and US imperialism was in the world situation during Trump, as a result of some of these unilateral approaches, it's moving back to the globalist approach of putting together NATO, strengthening it, and acting in unison with other imperialist forces against all of the forces of resistance, including China, Russia, and many other countries like Iran, Venezuela, and other countries. So this is because, as I said, US is has not been able in the past few decades to hold its grip on the world situation. Okay, so what we are witnessing therefore is several trends. One is a total rearrangement of forces, and new poles are emerging. And this new poles, before in the first Cold War, we had Soviet Union and its allies and socialist countries versus the imperialist camp. Now we are dealing with a new situation. This new situation now involves not in that communist versus socialist camps, but between emerging powers that their existence is becoming a challenge to the unilateral domination of the United States, and the countries that are resisting the US domination on the one hand, and the US imperialism that is trying to maintain its grip over the world situation. Of course, they have recognized that they cannot do it alone anymore. They're much weaker than before, and they need to bring back the Europeans to the fold. And that is what they are trying to do by emphasizing the role of NATO, by expanding NATO, strengthening its operations all over the place, and trying to do things in the context of NATO operations rather than solely US operation. We have been witnessing this with emphases that come from Biden administration, emphasizing the role of the NATO, importance of NATO, doing things with Europeans and all that. So the objective is to bring back Europeans as a junior partner to the US schemes, especially the military efforts. Of course, it's not easy to bring back the Europeans, in my view, because over time, the Europeans have developed very close ties in trade and economic ties and dealing with China, with some of the countries in the third world countries, so-called third world countries. Europe is now, I think China is the first trade partner of Europe, not the United States. So to pull back the Europeans to the US fold requires that US should elevate the conflicts to a military level, to a confrontational military level, so that it can force, once again, just as during the First Cold War, to push the Europeans to decide whether they want to follow their economic and social interests or whether they should go under the military umbrella of the United States. When the US tries to make it this black and white situation, the Europeans will be faced with a similar thing. Also knowing that it's losing its grip, the US is understanding that with the rise of China as a kind of a magnet for a lot of countries to deal with, many of these countries that are resisting the US oppression, US invasions, US sanctions, are getting closer and closer to China. Iran is one good example of it that is moving in that direction. China started helping Venezuela with vaccines and other things. So what the US is afraid of is that these countries may gradually gravitate toward China in this international rivalry that starts to intensify. And as a result, it is increasing its pressure on these countries, those resisting countries, to change their governments or impose a forced regime change before the actual alliance with China happens by these countries. So US is trying to, desperately, of course, trying to do everything it can to reverse the process that has been triggered by the rise of China by forcing the hands of many of these countries to make a decision or make a choice or be submitting to the US will before things get totally out of hand that US cannot reverse it. And in my view, US has a kind of a short period of time, a short window for doing that if it wants to do it. And that is why it's so desperate to intensify the conflicts as much as it can. And this, to me, is the most dangerous situation that we are facing today, and we have to deal with it. As to the US, one thing that kind of strikes me is that with the Trump, for 8 years of Trump, things have been turned into such a disarray and polarization and have been pushed so far to the right in the country that now even Biden looks good to a lot of people, which wasn't the case before. So we are having on our hand another period of kind of raising the consciousness against what Democrats are doing right now. And with Biden, at least in terms of domestic policy, trying to kind of fight more effectively against COVID, try to come with funds to support unemployed people and the working people, and taking some more clear positions on racism and all that. This again is going to pacify, it seems to us, resistance to its foreign policy, the same way it happened during the Obama administration. So that's a danger that can happen again. We may be facing again in the United States, that the movement in the United States must consciously try to overcome, because the battle is going to be long-term and the situation is very dangerous and we don't have much time. That is my general assessment of the situation. Thank you. You have given me the time.
Thank you so much, Bauman. Thank you for sharing all that with us. I'm sure that there's a lot of questions coming in that we're going to be addressing as soon as all the speakers have gone through. So now I'm pleased to announce the next speaker is Elizabeth Rowley. She's the leader of the Communist Party of Canada, born in British Columbia in 1949. She joined the CPC in 1967. And as a student at the University of Alberta, she was the party's youngest candidate in 1972. And she spoke out strongly for women's reproductive rights and an end to the Vietnam War while running in the riding of Edmonton Strathcona. She's been a party organizer since 1973 and a member of the Central Executive Committee since 1978. Liz, please join us.
Thank you very much, Karen. And thanks very much to the Canadian Peace Congress for co-sponsoring this important event. And also very happy to share this virtual stage with all of the speakers who have preceded me. I wanted to take a little bit of a look at history and how what's happening now in some ways is a reflection of what's happened since 1945, and then talk a little bit about what are we going to do about this situation. So let me start with Canadian foreign policy, which until the end of the Second World War was essentially determined by British imperialism. After World War II, the US imperialism certainly dominated. British imperialism lost its top spot as the global imperialist power. 1946 also introduced the first Cold War, which was directed at the Soviet Union and the socialist system of states in Europe. But it was also directed at the labor movement, the communist parties, and the left in the capitalist countries, and at the national liberation movements around the world. The purpose of that Cold War was to break up the support and solidarity of the working class and the labor movements in the capitalist countries, with the working class and the labor movement in the socialist countries, and with the national liberation movements struggling against neocolonialism and imperialism. Its purpose was also to isolate the communist parties and communists in the labor and people's movements who were fighting for peace, détente, and disarmament, and for unity and solidarity with workers struggling around the world. Its purpose was also to frighten others into silence with threats of political and social isolation, job losses, blacklists, and all the other consequences. And finally, its purpose was to launch another war against the USSR and the socialist countries, a mass campaign of lies and disinformation, plus an arms race, the Korean War, and military adventures around the world. Sound familiar? The defeat of the Cold War, of the first Cold War, was achieved through the strength and resilience of the Soviet Union and the socialist system of states in the post-war period, reconstruction, and a policy of peace, détente, and disarmament, which acted as a counterfoil to imperialism and prevented the outbreak of a global war through the 20th century. It was also the result of victories of the national liberation movements, particularly through the 1960s and 70s. Of course, the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the Chinese Revolution in 1949, and the rejection of the Cold War in the 1960s, and the growth of a powerful peace movement in the 1970s and 80s, and a powerful anti-capitalist globalization movement in the 1990s, both of which brought millions of people into the streets in mass protests and demonstrations demanding governments change their policies. There were setbacks, the main one of which, of course, Bauman just spoke about, and it was the loss of the Soviet Union and the socialist states in the 1990s. The declaration of the end of history, meaning the end of socialism as a global force, the end of working class struggle and anti-capitalist struggles, the end of the national liberation movements, the end of the peace movement, or at least that's what those who made those proclamations, Fukuyama in the first place, hoped would be the result. The domination of the world by imperialism through war, regime change, coup d'etat, torture, black sites, etc., etc. The deconstruction of the mass peace movement, peace organizations, and peace actions through war propaganda, such as the doctrines of responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention. If ever there was a way to twist ideas and words, these two are them. Well, this is the history of the last 30 years, and it's the reason why Canada's foreign policy shifted from complicity with US imperialism to military involvement in dirty US wars around the world, including vast military spending and a ramping up of anti-communist propaganda and a massive disinformation campaign aimed to manufacture consent for war and aggression. Well, today we're heading into, we're in the midst of a new Cold War, which is, as others have already said today, is the result of US imperialism losing its dominant place in the global economy, Canada's complete economic and political integration into US imperialism's golden agenda, and US foreign policy. It's a result of the growth of the reactionary, white supremacist, and fascist forces and ideas in Canada and in the US, of course, through Trump's 4 years of disastrous administration. It's the result of US control of culture and information through mass media in English-speaking Canada in particular, but also in Quebec. It's the result of pandemic and economic crisis, which has refocused public attention on domestic issues of how to live through this pandemic without getting sick or dying or seeing relatives die or hanging on to a job or not losing your home or being evicted and so forth. It's also a result, this new Cold War, of the domination of the CLC, the Canadian Labour Congress, and the labor movement in English-speaking Canada by the Liberal Party and by new labor politics of the NDP. Some of this Omar spoke about a few minutes ago, but it's pretty serious. And it shows up in the unanimous declaration by Parliament of genocide of the Uyghur people in China. So unanimous declaration of Parliament means that all the NDP, all the Green, all the Bloc, the Independents, the Tories, of course, they were the ones who made the motion, and all of the Liberals, with the exception of Cabinet, who we know support the declaration. It's also referenced in the call to cancel and boycott the Olympic Games in China this summer. And it's manifested in the CLC's call for implementation of the recommendations of the subcommittee of the International Human Rights Committee of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. What a mouthful. It means essentially that the CLC is echoing the demands of the Conservative Party to attack China, to support the sanctions, to support import controls because of so-called forced labor, to review procurement policies in Canada and affect trade policies and so forth. So a really terrible decision and statement by the Canadian Labour Congress with no factual evidence for any of this. But it certainly reflects what's been pretty evident for some time now, and that is how much influence the Liberal Party of Canada has on the labor movement, and in particular, the Canadian Labour Congress leadership. Because of course, this policy was not adopted by any convention. It was adopted by the top leadership. That's where this comes from, the top leadership of the CLC. And how another example of this closeness between the CLC leadership and the Liberal Party is the wide support that the CLC gave to the recent free trade agreement and the NAFTA agreement before that, which is a job-killing agreement and which is also profoundly affects Canadian foreign policy, trade, Canadian independence in general, of which there is very little left at this point. Well, now we get to the question of what to do about it. I think that what's pretty obvious here and pretty vital is the need to rebuild the peace forces in this country, to make peace and disarmament an issue in the labor movement. Well, this Canadian Labour Congress Convention is taking place in June this year. And I understand that there are a number of resolutions calling for a reversal of these kinds of pro-war policies and approach by the CLC leadership. And so there should be some good debates at the convention over what CLC policy should be in terms of foreign policy and in terms of the Cold War policies on China and other parts of liberal policy, Canadian government policy. We need to link the fight for peace and disarmament to the fight for jobs and civilian spending versus military spending. In short, jobs, not bombs. We need to link the fight for peace and disarmament to the fight against climate change and the huge carbon footprint created by the military in Canada and globally. We need to link the fight for peace and disarmament and security with the fight for environmental justice and survival. We need to make peace and disarmament a central issue in the coming federal election, which is likely to take place in Canada this fall. We need to call, for example, for the Canadian government to abandon their purchase of fighter jets and warships, which are equivalent to $95 billion in this budget, the federal budget that just came down earlier this week. To adopt an independent Canadian foreign policy of peace and disarmament, to get out of NATO and NORAD, to cut military spending by 75% and use those funds instead for job creation, for creating a national childcare system, for creating jobs and so forth, for civilian spending in short. To end the arms manufacture and exports in Canada, to uphold international law, and to release Meng Wanzhou and end the sanctions against China and also against Venezuela and many other countries that Canada has also added to its list for sanctions because of the US sanctions that have been imposed. We also need to expose Canada's role as an active participant in regime change. Canadians still like to think of Canada as a force for peace in the world, but as others have said, Canada is not a force for peace, to the contrary. So we need to show people what is Canada's role in Haiti, in Venezuela, where we have a very big role through the Lima Group, in Yugoslavia, Libya, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere that others have already spoken to. We have to expose Canada's changing policy towards Cuba, and Canada slide into sanctions and moving towards support for the blockade that the US has had against Cuba for 60 years in an attempt to strangle the economy and to starve the people of Cuba into submission. And we need to expose Canada's complicity in the US war on China, Meng Wanzhou's illegal arrest and detention, and the effort to extradite her to the US on trumped up charges. Expose also the consequences of these policies in Canada. How much greater is the danger of war involving Canada and Canadians, either in war games or in the event that a war would actually take place on Canadian soil. And once, of course, you start using nuclear weapons, there's no such thing as limited nuclear war. Once nuclear weapons are used, that's it. It's all over. We also need to expose the growth of reaction in the far right, because with war comes reaction at home and attacks on Asian Canadians and visible minorities, and job losses, militarism of the economy, and militarism of our youth. So many unemployed, so many young people who aren't going to get jobs, but who are going to be hustled, I would say, by the military into recruitment. And finally, we need to do what we can to reject and oppose anti-communism and the attacks on free speech, on science, and on accurate information, and so on. Well, the war propaganda is what we were hearing about China. And these are war propaganda. It means preparations for war in Canada and war on China. So we also need to press the CLC to speak out for peace and disarmament against NATO and NORAD. And these are its current policies. These are its current policies against NATO and NORAD. But you never hear that when you hear from the CLC. So silence is not golden at this point. Silence is covered with blood. And our responsibility as progressive people in this country and as Force for Peace and Disarmament is to get busy organizing and help the Canadian people, working people, to make their voices heard in the way that they did during the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, before these movements were torpedoed by the US and with the complicity of the Canadian government. So I will stop there and thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Liz. That was very comprehensive, and I'm sure we have lots of questions. I can see those coming in. So please post the questions in the live chat. We do have comrades who are collecting questions, and we will be answering your questions in just a little while. So I'm pleased to announce our final speaker for today is Max Blumenthal. Max is an award-winning journalist and editor-in-chief of The Gray Zone. He's also the author of Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel, The 51-Day War, Ruin and Resistance in Gaza, and most recently, the book, The Management of Savagery, How America's National Security State Fueled the Rise of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Donald Trump. Max, thank you for joining us. Please go ahead.
How's everybody doing? Thanks for having me today, and thanks for being so patient. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm just working with the volume levels right now. Yeah, I'm sure that so much ground has already been covered, so I'll kind of focus on the work we're doing at the Gray Zone in this very bleak media landscape. I was actually watching, I don't know if anyone watched UFC last night, UFC 261. Zhang Weili, the Chinese fighter who is the current female strawweight champion, fought Thug Rose Mamajunas, who was spouting anti-communist tirades leading up to the fight. And what Mamajunas, who fights out of Colorado in the US, was saying was, this is for the communists who killed my grandfather. And she let it slip that her grandfather was a Lithuanian. Her family's from Lithuania, and he was fighting against the Soviets and was killed by the Soviets. So she was going to avenge the death of her grandfather by beating this Chinese fighter. And the entire media missed the obvious fact that her grandfather was a Nazi collaborator who was fighting with the Nazis as they carried out the Holocaust of bullets, just murdering Jews one by one across Lithuania and the other Baltic states. And so as Zhang entered the arena, she was met with a hailstorm of boos. This was held in Jacksonville, Florida. It was the first all in-person event. So the arena was packed. And then chants of USA, USA began to bellow from the crowd. It was clear that this crowd had been very well infected with not just the anti-communism that forms America's national religion, but the anti-China sentiment that has been cultivated in a short period, really since 2018, and has begun to permeate the majority of the American public, with leaders of both parties sounding almost identical, and the media functioning as an anti-China mighty Wurlitzer. The Pew polling agency has shown that back in 2018, a majority of Americans viewed China favorably. And now I think 3/4 view China unfavorably and consider it the greatest threat to the United States. So propaganda works. And we've seen a wave of anti-Asian hate crimes. And I haven't done any reporting or study or research of them, so I can't draw any firm conclusion. and point directly to Cold War propaganda as the source, but it's clearly infected the general culture. So the Senate, the US Senate, passed a bill last week to declare these anti-Asian attacks hate crimes, to stiffen the penalties for perpetrators. It was basically virtue signaling. There are already federal hate crime laws on the books, which could easily be applied. And at the same time, just a week prior to that, the Senate passed the Strategic Competition Act of 2021, which authorizes $300 million for anti-China propaganda, specifically to demonize, and this is spelled out explicitly in this proposal, in this bill, to demonize the Belt and Road Initiative and to sponsor, in the words of the bill, independent media to carry out public diplomacy, which is Beltway speak for propaganda, against Chinese interests. Basically, the media will be incentivized with this gigantic sum of taxpayer money to catapult the propaganda against China even further than it already has been. And this really speaks to the role that the US media has played. It's as if a conductor has just stepped in and tapped his conducting rod, and the entire band of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and even The Nation and Democracy Now!, whereas we've documented at the Gray Zone, over 75% of their stories about China are deeply negative. They play the composition that has been presented to them by the US State Department, whether it's Mike Pompeo or Tony Blinken, who I call Mike Pompeo with lower body mass index. Also could refer to him as Tony Blinkskrieg. The media no longer requires an Operation Mockingbird, where journalists are kind of covertly paid to toe the CIA line. The media in the US it has been completely captured by US intelligence. And this is what we do at the Gray Zone, is we document how this process is taking place. It's taking place right in front of our eyes. It's not although there obviously a good part of it is covert, but it's easy to understand how it takes place if you understand how the CIA now functions in broad daylight, or other wings of US intelligence, or for example, the State Department Global Engagement Center, which is the State Department's official kind of propaganda wing. And we at the Gray Zone have even come under attack by publications that are funded by the State Department Global Engagement Center, like Coda Story, for our work exposing this propaganda, specifically the propaganda that focuses on Xinjiang. So I'm going to talk about that. When we hear about what's happening in Xinjiang, and we hear about the Uyghurs and the alleged genocide being perpetrated against us, we don't typically hear about them through on-the-ground reporting. We hear about them through studies, like the kind conducted by Adrian Zentz, who is a fellow here of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I'm sure everyone watching has heard of him. Most of you are familiar with him. We've done a lot of work exposing him. He's a Christian fundamentalist who has said he's led by God against the Communist Party of China. He is a bigot who opposes gay rights, women's equality. He says that diversity education is a mark of the Antichrist. He, of course, says that the Antichrist is a communist. And this is someone who's taken seriously in US media. If you look at any report from the BBC, the Washington Post, it's citing Adrian Zentz, or it's citing something that relies on Adrian Zentz. And his reports are not published by any academic institution. They're published by the Jamestown Foundation, which was established under the watch of Ronald Reagan's CIA, run by Bill Casey, to find a way of paying Soviet dissidents at the time without, directly paying them through US intelligence. So there's no fact checking that takes place there. There's no peer review. It's why it was so easy for me and Gareth Porter to take Zentz's study on supposed forced sterilization, which was cited by Mike Pompeo as the basis for his genocide designation, and just absolutely rip it to shreds, show all of the falsehoods that were just sitting there that anyone could have caught. It wasn't like we have some special forensic abilities, although I think we're pretty good. I mean, he said that women in Xinjiang receive 400 to 800 IUD insertions per year per capita, which means per person. Each woman in Xinjiang receives 400 to 800 IUD insertions a year, which means they're spending all day on the operating table getting 5 IUDs placed inside them. I don't know how they would have time for forced labor. He quietly corrected these bogus assertions and just boneheaded mistakes right after I did a panel, a discovery panel with some of our friends. I think Radhika Desai organized it. The day after, Zentz issued these corrections, but he backdated the report. He backdated the corrections to cover up the fact that it was a response to my presentation in my piece with Gareth. And someone analyzed the metadata and showed that he actually fabricated the date of his corrections. More recently, Adrian Zentz accused an academic, I believe an American academic, of being a Chinese bot, of being a Chinese astroturfed false Twitter identity, and got her account removed from Twitter because she had criticized his shoddy methodology. And so now her husband is preparing a libel suit against Adrian Zentz, and Zentz has been caught, again, just completely lying. It's not just Adrian Zentz. You have the Australian Strategy and Policy Institute, which was there, placed in Australia, which is kind of like our Israel in the Pacific. It's being transformed into this bulwark against China, against the wishes of its population. And you can see how this process is taking place by looking at who funds ASPI. It's largely the State Department and the arms industry, the State Department, which has a vested interest in Americanizing Australian foreign policy, and the arms industry, which benefits directly from a new Cold War with China. And, they have this like 23-year-old kid, Nathan Rooser, who I'm not sure how often he leaves his bedroom, but he certainly hasn't done any field work in China. And he is the main figure that the US media, that the Western media turns to when they want to prove that China has this massive gulag archipelago of internment centers or concentration camps where 1 million Uyghurs or 3 million Uyghurs, the number constantly goes up, are being held captive. And all he does is analyze Google Earth and find structures that resemble internment centers, and which are often government buildings, schools, dormitories. And then that's good enough for US media to go on. And actually, some of these studies are also produced by the Open Technology Fund, which is also funded through the State Department, and they've partnered with BuzzFeed. But the point is, the US government is funding these studies. They take place, they're carried out by non-experts, and they are conducted from the outside, often by people who speak no Chinese, have no knowledge of anything on the ground. The few actual journalistic forays into Xinjiang have been comically bad and marked with just outright lies. They often, you'll often see a hidden camera investigation as though a hidden camera is necessary. The journalist will put a filter on it to make things look sinister. They'll claim they're being tailed without proving that the car behind them, because there are cars in places like Urumqi and Kashgar that drive behind you. They don't prove that it's Chinese intelligence following them. And they make wild claims. I recently saw a CNN report on the lost children of Xinjiang, where basically several Uyghur separatist parents who had moved to Australia and to the West and gotten in contact with the separatist organizations had left several of their children behind with their own parents. And CNN found the children living happily with their grandparents. Obviously, they missed their parents. And then they would say, we found them near a suspected internment center, or a group of children were in an orphanage because their parents basically left them in the street. And the CNN reporter said they were being detained. They were captured by China and detained. Like what is a society supposed to do with kids who are put out in the street? How is this not irresponsibility on the part of the parents? The viewer was never, you have to kind of arrive at those basic logical points yourself. But for the most part, virtually everything we're seeing and hearing in US media is being guided by the hand of US intelligence or the State Department through its Global Engagement Center. And the many attacks that we've received at the gray zone for poking holes in these narratives and exposing them for the fraud that they are have also been funded by these same sources. And I should also name one other source of funding and as well as training for the Uyghur separatist movement that helps heavily influence US media, and that's the National Endowment for Democracy. This was funded in 1983 also by William Casey, under the watch of William Casey, Reagan's CIA director. It funds the World Uyghur Congress and all of its subsidiaries, including the Uyghur American Association, whose members we recently saw earlier this month heckle an anti-Asian hate crime rally. They actually had a car caravan in DC that drove by anti-racism demonstrators and heckled them. The Uyghur Human Rights Project, the Campaign for Uyghurs, run by former Guantanamo Bay translator and Pentagon contractor Rushan Abbas, also funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. And the National Endowment for Democracy funds a lot of media, not just on the issue of Xinjiang, but they're also funding a outlet called Myanmar Now, which the Western media relies on entirely for all the coverage you're seeing and hearing about massacres of supposedly peaceful protesters in Myanmar. The organization that does the death counts in Myanmar is also funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy was created, in the words of one of its founders, Alan Weinstein, to do what the CIA did covertly, to do it overtly, to do it in the open. So as I said, all of this is taking place openly. And I guess just to wrap up, I know that Q&A is coming up. Just to wrap up, I have a story that should be out early this week. I don't want to telegraph my punches too much, but it will expose in a pretty disturbing light how the narrative of forced labor in Xinjiang was developed, and how actually the AFL-CIO, which works hand in glove with the National Endowment for Democracy and has been a participant in destabilization campaigns against socialist governments for going back to the 1940s, how they actually pressured auditors to not visit factories in Xinjiang, to actually leave the area so that there could be no on-the-ground independent monitoring of what was taking place there. And it would allow the sources that are basically US intelligence cutouts to totally dominate the narrative from the outside with their phony Google Earth studies, with Adrian Zentz's mad scrawlings, with these exile testimonies by exiles who are cultivated by Uyghur separatist organizations, often incentivized with visas to the United States, sort of Uyghur version of Curveball, the Iraqi exile who gave us all of those accurate stories about WMD. So, but this story will show how the official labor movement in the US has actually been enlisted as a weapon against China in what amounts to sanctions. All these companies are being pressured to pull out of Xinjiang that produce apparel and employ lots of Uyghur workers. And what they're basically being pushed to do is to fire all their workers, leave them jobless, do nothing to remediate them from a worker rights perspective, and to administer sanctions by other means. And I think what we're seeing is actually an attack on the people of Xinjiang from the outside by the U.S. and its allies as an attack on the minds of our friends and neighbors and people who we come into contact with on a daily basis in our own communities by this mockingbird media. So I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Max. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's a lot of ground to cover. And I want to thank all of our speakers for the all of your insights. We're going to take the Q&A now. We're going to start the Q&A section. So if you want to bear with me, I'm just going to pull up some questions that came in. So one of the questions, actually this was reiterated a couple times, so it's a good question to ask. Can the panelists, and you all can take turns, can you all elaborate further on how the anti-China foreign policy of the US and Canada is fueling anti-Asian racism in these countries? So who wants to go first? Anti-Asian racism. How the anti-Chinese foreign policy affects anti-Asian racism. Omar, go ahead.
If you look, anti-Chinese racism has a long history in the United States and Canada, that we know. But if you look at the incidence of actual vituperation or violence against the Chinese or Chinese-looking Americans and Canadians historically, they were quite low before 2018. They were there, but they were low, and they had mostly to do with the stereotypes that the Chinese study too hard, etc., etc. Starting with this campaign against China, that the US and Canada and other Western governments started about COVID being a Chinese disease, added to that, that China is persecuting the Uyghurs, is conducting a genocide, that China is the monster. These incidents have really ballooned tremendously. So the clear linkage is that this anti-China propaganda is having a direct impact on our neighbors, on our colleagues, on our brothers and sisters of Chinese ancestry, as far as I can tell.
Thank you. Great. Any others? Anybody else want to chime in?
Sure, I'll have a word.
Go ahead, Liz.
Well, I think I want to agree with what Omar has said, but just to add a little bit, and I think the obvious comparators, the anti-Muslim feeling in the country, and that was first generated by Trump in the U.S. and the anti-immigrant actions and the focus on Muslims. Picked up with the anti-secularism bills in Quebec, and suddenly it's okay to be mad at a particular group of people, and when people are there, they know that things are not good in the country, that they can tell from their own economic conditions, but they're not sure who's responsible, but they're sure somebody's responsible. And they start looking around, and the government provides them with the government and the media and corporations provide them with the scapegoats. Well, it's China, it's Muslims, it's this and that. And I think when you add to that one of the issues around the free trade agreements and jobs is that the cost of labor in Canada is high relative relative, not to the cost of living, but to the cost of labor in many parts of the world, including China, where the cost of labor is a lot less than it is in Canada. And this suddenly enables people to be justified in being angry about the fact that a lot of jobs have left Canada and have, ended up in cheap labor parts of the world. So this is the, instead of being angry at governments and at corporations, which are responsible for this situation, people who are ignorant and are looking for explanations for how they can divert growing anger is an acceptable to some. It's an acceptable way to vent their anger. So once we start talking about anger, it doesn't take very far from feeling angry at a particular group of people to for some people to start taking action. The horrendous story of the woman who, not story, but the reality of a Chinese woman in Vancouver, I think it was, who was kicked in the chest and stomped. I mean, these are extremely dangerous actions, and for the government of Canada to say, "Tut tut, this is a bad thing." Well, this was the conditions for this to happen were created, deliberately created.
Yes, thank you so much. Definitely. And I definitely agree with the parallel between anti-Asian racism that we're seeing and the anti-Muslim bigotry that we also saw following the declaration of the war on terror. Okay, another question that we have right now is, can anyone comment on the situation in Hong Kong and the so-called umbrella movement? What is the role of the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions and its relationship with the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy?
Actually, I don't have the article in front of me, but we reported on that in detail at the Gray Zone in an article by Dan Cohen on how the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID essentially astroturfed these protests, and the National Confederation for Trade Unions received hundreds of thousands of dollars a year from the National Endowment for Democracy. There's also the Solidarity Center from the AFL-CIO, which is a key piece of the architecture of U.S. regime change operations. And what it does is it trains and supports unions that oppose governments where the U.S. seeks regime change. They've been especially active in Venezuela. So they've worked with anti-Chavista unions there that have been aligned with Leopoldo Lopez and now Juan Guaido. But in Hong Kong, they also worked with the, so I would call them the separatist unions, the Confederation of Trade Unions being one of them. And the Solidarity Center is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. So, I mean, when you see an embassy official like Julie Ide, who was caught on camera in Hong Kong meeting with the kind of poster children of the Hong Kong protests like Joshua Wong and Nathan Law, that's really just a kind of visual realization of the project that's been taking place for years and years in broad daylight, where a U.S. intelligence cutout is sponsoring and training these organizations and giving them the sense that if they get out there in the streets, they riot, they take over parliament. The Hong Kong parliament was attacked in the same way that the U.S. Capitol was attacked on January 6th. It was vandalized much more harshly. I was at the U.S. Capitol. I didn't see the same kind of vandalism. And, no one said anything in the U.S. If anything, it was sort of celebrated as pro-democracy protest. But this is what was taking place. This is what the U.S. regime was sponsoring. And now China has passed a national security law to outlaw organizations that have been funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. This is exactly what the United States or any other country that actually valued its national security and stability would do. And so what the U.S. is doing is attacking China for the national security law, calling it sort of an attack on democracy. And that's an outcome that the National Endowment for Democracy can live with, because it's obviously not trying to support workers. It's not in solidarity with working people. It's simply trying to destabilize states and using those people as fodder.
Thank you, Max. Go ahead, Vijay.
I'd just like to put Hong Kong into some context for people in Canada, which was also part of the British Empire. I think it may not be any longer well known to people that from 1842 to 1997, Hong Kong and the surrounding area had been seized by the British Empire as a consequence of the imposed Opium Wars. In Britain, there is a great amnesia about its colonial and imperial history. In China, there is not an amnesia. People are well aware of the humiliations imposed on the Chinese people as a consequence of the two Opium Wars, the seizure of Hong Kong. It's important to know that right now on BBC, one of the great champions of democracy in Hong Kong is Mr. Chris Patten, who was the last Governor General of Hong Kong. Hong Kong from 1842 to 1997 had no democracy, no adult suffrage under the British Empire. Mr. Chris Patten somehow after 1997 has become a champion of democracy. This is a lot like Mr. Barack Obama, 8 years of being the president of the United States. And after his 8-year term in the presidency, he talks about moving an agenda in Washington, as if he didn't have 8 years to even attempt to move an agenda. Now, think about Hong Kong and decolonization. Do you think it's fitting for the British to control the Malvinas Islands off the coast of Argentina? No Argentinian believes that Malvinas should be under British control. That fake war conducted by Margaret Thatcher to defend what they call the Falklands, highly opposed by the Argentinian people, despite the fact that Argentina at the time was under a military junta's rule. They still opposed British control of what is essentially Argentinian. When the Indian government marched into Goa to take Goa from Portuguese colonialism, nobody said anything. India didn't wait 50 years for a handover from Portugal. India sent the military into Goa, Daman and Diu to seize these Portuguese areas into the Indian Union. There was no negotiated return. The Chinese actually had been quite patient, waiting for the lease to expire in 1997 and then taking back China through a process which was always unsustainable. The idea of one country, two systems was always going to be unsustainable. It's not possible to maintain that. Inevitably, there was going to be some sort of integration of Hong Kong into the rest of China. You'd be naive to expect that to last forever. So let's just put this on the table. I find a great deal of hypocrisy in the conversations around Hong Kong. People who are resolute imperialists and have been so for their whole careers now talking about democracy in Hong Kong. BBC should be ashamed of itself. BBC right through the period after the end of British rule in southern Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe, BBC consistently tried to undermine developments in Zimbabwe. Whatever the problems might have been in Zimbabwe, BBC just focused on Zimbabwe as if to say, let's go back to Cecil Rhodes' Rhodesia. It's a disgrace. The British have no locus standi to make any statement about Hong Kong, as long as the British themselves have no plan right now to deal with the northern provinces of Ireland, which want to be integrated into the rest of Ireland, particularly after the collapse of their ridiculous Brexit plan. So let's be fair here. The question of Hong Kong, who's funding this, that, what Max said is all true. But there's a broader issue here. There's a much broader issue here. You want to talk about democracy? People in Hong Kong have much more rights now than they had under British dominion. Let's face that. Perhaps people want more democratic rights. Fine, let them deal with that. But who is to say that it is some special saw on the world when there are so many saws? When are the British going to give the Chagosian people back Diego Garcia? When is the United States going to leave that base behind? When is the United States going to honor the rights of the people of Guam, Hawaii, Okinawa, and so on, and withdraw those bases? I'm fed up with hearing people become so outraged about Hong Kong when they say nothing about Okinawa, nothing about Guam, nothing about Hawaii, these US military bases that poison the Pacific Ocean.
Kiran?
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Max. Yeah, 1 minute, Omar. I definitely agree. The settler colonial Canada does not have much of a leg to stand on. Omar, go ahead.
I completely agree with what's been said before, but quickly. The riots or the protests in Hong Kong started because of the extradition bill. A rapist was being wanted back from Hong Kong, and the people protested that there should be no extradition. That was one. The Western governments supported Hong Kong, the protests, as the Canadian Labour Congress and the AFL-CIO. Yet there was not one single working class demand per se, the working class conditions in Hong Kong among the 5 key demands of the protesters. And so sometimes our ultra left, our labor leading bodies get caught up in Western inspired or Western supported movements, at least.
I want to say very quickly, I think there's one word that ties a lot of these statements together, and that's white supremacy. There is this notion that people who are not white don't have a right to their own sovereignty, that the British can have carved up China, stolen Hong Kong, and still feel like they have a right to comment about anything going on there. That is, I think, a big part of US antipathy towards China. People who aren't white are not supposed to be the economic or any other equal of white-led nations. So I think ironically, this appeal against anti-Asian violence, it starts with white supremacy of attacking China. Then, of course, they come in at the end and pretend to be non-racist with these appeals.
Spot on, Margaret. Thank you so much. Absolutely. White supremacy is at the root of colonialism, really. So we have a few more questions here. I'm going to ask any of the panelists who want to speak up. We have one question that says, can someone speak on the Cold War on the Russian Federation? In particular, can you reflect on why Zelensky in Ukraine is doing a complete 180, bringing about peace within Ukraine and about joining NATO? Is it because of pressure from the West and the neo-Nazis in power, or because he was simply a con artist? So basically, if you can speak on Ukraine and the Cold War that the US and its allies are waging against Russia, that would be great.
Well, Ukraine was, in 2014, the US intervened. President Yanukovych, who was elected, you never hear him described that way, but the US took sides in Ukraine's internal dispute, sided with the far right, some of whom are actually Nazis, in order to try to take Ukraine out of Russia's orbit. The end result after 7 years is Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe with an ongoing civil war, thousands of lives lost. Zelensky recently, and Ukraine does nothing independently. Ukraine is a colony, de facto colony of the US, was massing troops near the Donbass region, the region that is in revolt against the government in Kiev. And he backed down when Russia sent troops to Ukraine's border, and Putin declared that that is not going to happen. Ukraine is not going to be a member of NATO. Ukraine is nothing but a source of cheap labor for the rest of Europe. It's not going to be in the EU. Russia has said its NATO membership is a non-starter. So let's remember these, there's lots to say about Ukraine, but I think those are the basics. Those are the things that we need to know about that situation.
Thank you. Anybody else want to speak up?
It's funny how we heard so much about how Trump was destroying our alliances, and that we needed a steady state to come back in Washington and restore diplomacy. Joe Biden immediately declared diplomacy is back. And now that the steady state is in power, things seem very unsteady. We're sort of constantly engaging in these dangerous acts of brinksmanship with our Ukrainian bullet stoppers sent to the front lines, and this president who was essentially a reality TV show star and a comedian who was elected on a kind of peace ticket to implement the Minsk Accords with Russia, turning into a war president, showing up in a ridiculous camouflage outfit with a helmet, sort of shades of Mike Dukakis in his tank in 1988, on the front lines in Donbass, under enormous pressure, as Margaret pointed out, domestically from the far right, which has gained, it totally entrenched itself within Kiev, and has an entire armed wing, a neo-Nazi armed wing, the Azov Battalion, and the National Corps, which is active under the watch of the Interior Ministry in Kiev. This President Zelensky's approval rating is dropping into the 20s. He's becoming unpopular. Elections are coming up. And another thing that he's done besides escalating in the Donbass with these daily shellings of civilian areas and the troop escalation is issue a call to retake Crimea, obviously for domestic political reasons, to look like a tough guy, which is a pretty disturbing signal to Russia. And he has banned opposition media, just gone and taken opposition media off the air, which caters to the Russian-speaking population, which has been embarrassing him. Stations owned by a billionaire, Medvedchuk, have been taken off air, and the U.S. State Department has issued a statement of support for what Zelensky is doing. If this was taking place in Venezuela, well, it would be condemnation, but they don't. The U.S. is supporting this all-out attack on Russian language media in countries where it seeks total influence, or in NATO, or countries that are already oriented with NATO. And so just yesterday, YouTube announced that it had taken these stations offline as well, obviously at the behest of the US State Department. So the US is working with this hopelessly corrupted president who refuses to meet with the leadership of Donetsk and Lugansk, the two regions of the Donbass, which is the first requirement of implementing the Minsk Accords. He refuses to meet with them. Instead, he just constantly is meeting with his patrons in the US. And the US is supporting his reign of repression. The hypocrisy could not be more glaring here. And of course, none of this is relayed back to the US public by its media.
Karen?
Yep. Go ahead,
Sorry,
Omar.
can I just say a word about the Crimea? Historically, the Crimea was part of Russia. The population of the Crimea is 65% Russian, 15% Ukrainian, and 12% Tatar. So when the color revolution took place in Ukraine in 2014 that Margaret talks about, Russia was very worried that they would militarize Crimea and take over that naval base. The Soviet Union in 1954 gave the Crimea from the Russian Soviet Federation to the Ukrainian Soviet Federation. After 2014, they got very worried that it would become part of NATO. And so they reacted, held a referendum. 83% of the people voted, 97% saying they wanted to join Russia rather than stay with the Ukraine. Thanks.
Great, thank you. All right, we have a couple more questions. So one question is, how do you view China, as capitalism on steroids or something else? So that's a nice big question, if anybody wants to take that on. Go ahead, Vijay, thank you.
Yeah, this is one of those questions where you get people wanting to pin a label on 1.4 billion people and a very complicated system, saying, is it capitalist? Is it socialist? What is it? Look, first thing we need to acknowledge is that every single revolution of a socialist kind took place in a poor country, a backward country, a peasant country, whether it's starting with the revolution against the Tsarist Empire, which was largely a peasant country, and so on. Where is the revolution in Germany, in Britain, in the United States, in Canada? None of the advanced industrial countries had a revolution. These countries had to innovate. That's why the Lenin's advance over Marxism was very important, which is why at least the formations I've belonged to are generally Marxist Leninist formations. The idea that you have to seize the opportunity in a colonial context of building a new kind of society. The problem is colonialism prevented the development of capitalist productive forces, prevented the development. You can't wait around in India waiting for the British to develop your productive forces before you can advance to a socialist revolution. So the task became that communists, socialists in these parts of the world, the colonial parts of the world, had to both build the productive forces and socialize social wealth. It was a dual task, very complicated task. From 1949, by the way, at 1949, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had just come out of a war that went from 1937 to 1949. It's one of the longest World War IIs in the world anywhere. Spain had a World War II that also started early, but it ended much earlier than 1949. It had a landscape that had been almost entirely destroyed, when the communists came to government in 1949. So since 1949, the Chinese people at different levels and the leadership of the Chinese government has attempted in a zigzag fashion to both advance the productive forces and socialize production. At certain times, they find they've gone too far towards advancing productive forces. They zigzag back to socializing wealth. Right now, under Xi Jinping, they are trying to move more of a social agenda, abolishment of poverty, and so on. This is a real struggle. I mean, people always feel like they need to climb the highest mountain and condemn countries, saying, you're insufficiently socialist. For God's sake, Vietnam, bombed by the United States with chemical weapons, its agriculture destroyed, struggling to advance the productive forces under immense odds. And then people in the United States sit in the university departments condemning Vietnam, saying, oh, they are not sufficiently socialist. Go build socialism in your own country, man. Let them struggle with their own struggle. And to the point on this, look, you can't socialize poverty, friends. We are not utopian socialists. This is not Fourier and Saint-Simon and so on. We are not utopians. We believe in advancing the material forces. People need to have a certain social wealth in their hands. We don't just want to be abstractly equal, guys. I'm a Marxist. I'm not a utopian. So they have an immensely difficult task ahead of them. This kind of flimsy judgment, is China this, is China that? Relax, guys. Go back and build your revolution.
Can I have
Thank you. Yes, go ahead, Liz. Thanks.
Well,
Vijay.
I couldn't agree more with what Vijay has just said. I think that's it in a nutshell. I think what we need to look at is which direction are they moving in, and all of the evidence is that the deep poverty that has existed in China since before the revolution and during a good part of certainly the beginnings of the revolution, and various efforts that they made economically to try and turn the situation. Well, they've turned the situation. They've taken 700 million people out of deep poverty. They have a plan that they're going to, by 2035, they're going to eliminate deep poverty right across the country. By 2050, they are expecting that every Chinese citizen will have a moderate standard of living. They have made huge strides in terms of climate and the environment. And, they have, from a country of 1.4 billion people, who, in 1949, it was almost, the conditions were almost feudal to have advanced to where they are today, to playing the role that they are playing today at the international level. Well, this is something, has never happened before, and it's pretty significant, very important, I think. And I think I absolutely agree with Vijay. I think it is very, very flip for people who live in advanced capitalist countries in particular, to say this one is socialism, that one is not, this one is doing the right thing, that one is not. Really, the biggest contribution that we can make here in Canada and in the advanced capitalist countries is to show our solidarity with peoples of the world who are making advances, who are, breaking the chains of imperialism and colonialism and get on with the job in our own country. So it's not helpful, frankly, for people to make this the main issue. It's not the main issue. The main issue is imperialism and those forces which want to stop all progress and roll back the clock to, I don't know, the beginning of the 20th century. Not helpful.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
just quickly wanted,
Go
because
ahead.
I mentioned the Strategic Competition Act of 2021, which is really like the war with China bill. It's like the Iraq Liberation Act that the Senate passed back in 1997, I think it was, which called for regime change in Iraq. I mean, this is like a regime change with China bill, and it's clearly expressing the panic among the US financial elite and the foreign policy establishment about the success of the Belt and Road Initiative and China's construction of infrastructure. What's significant about the bill, besides the $300 million that I mentioned to demonize Belt and Road and demonize China and its government as a whole, is that it offers no encouragement or plan for the US to build infrastructure or to do anything that provides an alternative to countries that would seek to buy in to the new Silk Road. Instead, there's just $90 million allocated through the Inter-American Development Bank, which is just a neoliberal wing of American empire in Latin America, for countries to sign on to trade deals with the US on the condition that they do absolutely no business and accept no infrastructure deals with China. Meanwhile, in the Senate here, the idea of passing an infrastructure bill to repair this complete shell of a country is highly contentious and may not even pass. And the bill is actually being marketed as an anti-China bill to compete with China. We haven't built any bullet trains here. There's no train between Los Angeles and San Francisco that's even remotely viable. I don't know if Canadians know this, but you can't even take Amtrak between Los Angeles and San Francisco, the two business centers of the West Coast, without getting on a bus part of the way. Everybody either drives or they takes the bus. There is the infrastructure in this country is a joke, and we don't have a poverty eradication program. We have a poverty creation program, which we've seen under lockdown, under this COVID lockdown, where trillions of dollars has graduated upwards and people are being evicted en masse. So it's ridiculous. Even if I wanted to, it would just feel ridiculous for me to condemn China as capitalism on steroids when I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., watching this catastrophe unfold.
Yeah. Creation of poverty. Yes. Omar, go ahead.
So ultra leftists and their statements about China, you're not socialists, you're not this, you're revisionist, you are whatever. They remind me of Muslim mullahs whose own religiosity is to be challenged, and yet they're hurling fatwas against others that your religion is not good, your practices are not good. That is what the ultra left is doing about China, rather than, as Vijay says, trying to make revolutionary change in their own societies.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for that. There's just a couple of questions. One is for Margaret. So the question is, Margaret, what is the future of the BLM, Black Lives Matter movement, after it was used by liberals in anti-Trump protests? Could it turn into more wide social rights defense movement now? So what would you say is the future of that?
That's an odd question. I saw it in the chat. I don't know what this person meant by BLM being used by liberals. Black Lives Matter, the organization, is frankly very problematic. They have links with very wealthy people. They've raised something like $90 million because of this mass movement, this demand for justice against police violence. Now, the grassroots organizations around the country are those that are really attempting to meet the needs of the people. I don't think there's anything about the BLM that they allow themselves to be used by liberals. I mean, they represent people who are anti-Trump themselves. So I sort of don't understand the question. The problems are so deep that a mother of a kid, Tamir Rice, 12-year-old kid who was shot by the police in Cleveland, has criticized the leadership of Black Lives Matter as using her and other relatives of victims to build their own brand, so to speak. But having said all of that, no one should doubt the depth of support for Black Lives Matter among Black people. And last year we saw, after the killing of George Floyd, a movement that became very widespread, very diverse. And for the first time in history, a Black-led movement became popular and had, at least in polls, approval from most white people. So that is the most important thing to remember. This cry for justice is universally supported.
And there's a lot of anti-imperialist support, for example, for Palestine and things like that.
Yes, they were. The BLM, the organization, they were pushed into it, though. They were pushed into it by grassroots movements across the country, that they take on a left-wing stance, an anti-imperialist stance against another racist nation. True.
Thank you for that, Margaret. And I'm going to say the final question is, how do we encourage cooperation and unity between anti-imperialists globally and all those countries under sanction? So as I understand it, the question is more about building unity between people who are anti-imperialists who live in the imperialist countries. How do we increase anti-imperialist sentiment and solidarity across borders? Does anybody have any ideas for that? Vijay, go ahead, please.
The first thing I'd say is, at the state-to-state level, to start there is a formation that was created at the margins of the non-aligned movement meeting held in Caracas, Venezuela in 2019, which had a meeting in New York this year. And that is the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. There are 30 odd states that are a member of this platform. They will operate at the United Nations. I hope very much that the Group of 77 will endorse this grouping. I hope that the non-aligned movement, which turns 60 this year in September, it had its first meeting in Belgrade in 1961. By the way, today is the anniversary of the Bandung meeting of Asian and African countries in 1955. But I hope very much that states will endorse this Group of Friends to defend the UN Charter. I think it's a very important advance at the UN level, because the UN Charter is being disrespected by many, many countries. I must say, at the lead here is the United States, which treats it with contempt. So that's at that level. At the people-to-people level or movement-to-movement level, there are several platforms. I participate in one of them, and that's the International People's Assembly. The institute I run, Tricontinental, is a part of the general framework of the International People's Assembly. It's 200 political and social organizations from about 100 countries. We have a very good, a general orientation to world affairs. Plus, we participate in a formation, and please go to the website to look at this. We participate in a formation called a Week of Anti-Imperialist Struggles. I really encourage people to go to the website of the Week of Anti-Imperialist Struggles. Look for the kind of interventions that this formation has made. Get involved in one way or the other. Of course, I encourage people to get involved in formations like the peace councils in their countries. We are right now on the platform of the Canadian Peace Congress. I think that the peace councils must be developed into mass movements, must have a much bigger platform in our countries. You see, the idea of gathering together anti-imperialists must be done on a non-sectarian basis. And I would like to give a special plea for that. We need to become a mass movement of people who are dismayed at the fate of the planet, dismayed at the state of governments around the world. We shouldn't be trying to develop a very narrow perspective on things. We need to be out there with the broadest possible formation. I think, therefore, the unity around even the defense of the UN Charter is a great advance for humankind. So I think we require a broad platform, and I hope very much people participating in this webinar get involved in their peace councils, find out about the Week of Anti-Imperialist Struggles, find out about the International People's Assembly.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to chime in on this question about building anti-imperialist solidarity? Bauman, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I fully support what Vijay said. I would like to also mention that the World Peace Council, one of the oldest international organizations fighting against imperialism, is active and is working and is organizing in 5 different regions of the world, in 5 continents, and close to 100 national organizations are involved. But one thing I wanted to mention here, is that our struggle, anti-imperialist struggle, should go beyond sentimental support or political support. We need to give it some material aspect. There's a lot of concrete things that people can do in support of such organizations, such countries that are suffering in the hands of imperialism. In material terms, we can send support medical, we can send support financial, we can send support in various ways that helps them resist or survive or live through what the pressures are from abroad. So these are the things that we have to also do. It's not just enough to put our forces together and declare our support, but we have to take some material steps as well. That is my comment.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Very
Bauman.
quickly, sorry, Black Alliance for Peace, blackallianceforpeace.com. I'll just keep it simple and tell everyone to go to our website. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yes.
us too, thegrayzone.com. And, one thing we've done that's been very successful is we've launched a Spanish section. We just translate our work that's pertinent to Latin America into Spanish and have developed a really strong following in Latin America. And so I think, the value of translations can't be understated. And it feels so much more natural to bring our reporting and our politics to that audience. It's so much harder to explain to people in the imperial core what their government's doing. But I feel, like it's fallen on fertile soil in countries we've visited, even, just being in Tegucigalpa in Honduras and being recognized in the street for the work we've done is a great feeling. And it shows the kind of solidarity you can build on a shoestring. And people really value, being informed from the other side, from inside Washington about how the policies are being constructed and sold that affect their lives directly. So I'm hoping we can start doing more translations into other languages. And, you know, just the field reporting we've been able to do has been really important for us to build these kinds of connections. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to go to China yet, but that's definitely in the cards. And it's really thanks to our patrons, the people who support us on Patreon, you know, just individual contributors. So, you know, supporting alternative media like Black Alliance for Peace or the Gray Zone or the sponsors of this talk, I think is really essential if we're going to have any chance of convincing people when they're just under this constant attack, psychological attack from the mighty Wurlitzer of corporate Western media.
Thank you, Max. Omar, go ahead. Oh, you're muted now.
The people should visit the website of People's Voice, the newspaper of the Communist Party of Canada. They should also visit the website of the Communist Party of Canada itself. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I highly recommend checking out all of the organizations. Black Alliance for Peace. You can join if you can join as a member if you're a person of African descent. You can join part of the Solidarity Network if you're not a member. If you're not a person of African descent. So I think it's wonderful that there is this Solidarity Network for everybody as well. The Gray Zone and Moderate Rebels, which is a podcast that Max co-hosts along with Ben Norton. The U.S. Peace Council, which is Bauman's organization. I highly recommend Googling that. And of course, the Tricontinental Institute that Vijay is the director for. So I highly recommend checking out all of these organizations. I'm also, again, going to put on screen the card that has information in case you want to get in touch with the Canadian Peace Congress or the Communist Party of Canada. You can reach us at these places on our website or through social media. And we want to thank everyone who was part of this event today. I want to thank Vijay, Max, Omar, Margaret, Liz, and Bauman. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our people in the audience. Please join us again. There is another webinar on May 20th that's going to be featuring the issue of Meng Wanzhou, who, as we had mentioned before, is still under house arrest in Canada. And so please look out for that. You can join the Canadian Peace Congress, join us on the Twitter account or Facebook and follow us along there. We'll be posting more information about that. So with that, I'd like to bid adieu to everybody and have yourself a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.